The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric prayer above Oak Creek Memorial's critical care unit, a sound that had become as familiar to Natalie Hayes as her own heartbeat. She moved through the veterans' wing with a kind of precision that made other nurses uncomfortable, though none could say why. Her steps were measured. Her hands never shook. When she checked an IV line, she checked it twice, once for what she could see, once for what others might miss. The antiseptic smell clung to everything here, sharp and sterile, the scent of a place where broken bodies came to either heal or disappear. Room 312 sat at the end of the corridor, and Natalie stood in its doorway for a moment before entering, her fingers gripping the patient chart with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb lay in the bed before her, comatose, his spine shattered 3 years ago by an IED blast in Marjah. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside him, pushing oxygen into lungs that no longer knew how to breathe on their own. His left forearm lay exposed on the blanket, and Natalie's eyes found the tattoo immediately. Her name. Written in letters that had faded slightly over 3 years, but unmistakable. Natalie. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, the woman who had carried him 3 kilometers through enemy fire when the blast took his memory and his ability to walk. He would never know it was her. She placed the pair of worn combat boots on his windowsill with a gentleness that contradicted her military bearing. The boots were caked with dust from Marjah, dust that hadn't washed clean in all the years since. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the leather, the only physical tell she allowed herself anymore. A scar ran along her right forearm, white and thin, a memory of shrapnel that had come within millimeters of a radial artery. Pain was information. Pain was data. This scar meant she'd survived extraction under fire and kept moving anyway. Natalie opened Marcus's treatment file and began reading with the meticulous attention that made Dr. Sterling's jaw tighten whenever he observed her. The chart documented experimental medications for nerve regeneration, cutting-edge treatments with names like NeuroRestore for and synthetic myelin scaffolding. Premium rates, everyone. The hospital billed Medicare at $47,000 per treatment cycle for medications that Natalie had watched Dr. Sterling dilute to nearly half strength before administration. The dosages listed on the chart bore no resemblance to what actually entered Marcus's full line. Billing for one thing. Delivering another. She'd seen this pattern before, in places that didn't exist on maps, where medical supply chains broke down and field medics had to improvise. But this wasn't a field hospital in Helmand Province. This was Houston. This was supposed to be different. Her jaw clenched slightly as she made a notation in her own personal log, a leather-bound journal she kept locked in her locker, dated entries that documented inconsistencies. She never reported them officially. Reporting meant attention. Attention meant investigation. Investigation meant questions about her credentials, her background, her previous employment with the Navy that had no contact numbers and no verifiable references. She kept her head down. She kept her mouth shut. She did her job with the precision of someone who'd learned to make life-or-death decisions in the dark, and she let the small corruption slide past like she hadn't seen them. But Marcus Webb was different. Marcus Webb had her name on his forearm. The door to room 312 opened without warning, and Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like a man who'd been waiting for permission that would never come. He was tall, with the kind of expensive posture that money could buy, a tailored white coat over a dress shirt that probably cost more than Natalie earned in a week. His watch was an Omega Seamaster, the kind of thing that whispered about wealth in a room full of people earning $28 an hour. He watched her with eyes like ice in a tumbler of whiskey, cold and clarifying and dangerous. Hayes. He said her name the way someone might say a diagnosis they didn't like. You've been in this room a lot lately. I check on all my patients twice per shift. Her voice came out steady, deferential, the voice of a nurse who respected the hierarchy and knew her place. It's standard protocol. Standard protocol doesn't require reviewing billing codes. He moved closer, and the air pressure in the room seemed to change, the way it changed before a storm. I noticed you asking Janet about treatment costs for the veterans. Asking questions about which medications were actually being administered. Natalie closed the chart. She didn't look at him. She'd learned long ago that direct eye contact with men like Sterling was a form of confrontation, and confrontation was something she'd trained herself to avoid. I wanted to understand the treatment plan. For continuity of care. The treatment plan is not your concern. He was beside her now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something imported, something that reeked of confidence. Your concern is following orders and keeping your eyes on your own work. You understand? Yes, Doctor. Good. He placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that seemed almost intimate, almost possessive. This patient is under my direct care. His treatment is being carefully managed. There's no need for you to dig into things you don't have the clearance to understand. The word clearance hung in the air between them like a threat. It was a test word. It was a word that meant something different to people like Sterling than it meant to everyone else. It was a word that suggested he knew something about her, or suspected something, and was probing the edges of it to see if she would flinch. She didn't flinch. She never did. I apologize if I overstepped, Natalie said, her voice still that perfect pitch of professional deference. I was only trying to ensure the patient received the most effective care. Sterling smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that predators gave before they struck. Not kind. Not warm. The smile of someone who had just confirmed what he suspected. Just a nurse, he said softly. That's all you need to be. Leave the medical decisions to the doctors. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Doctor. He withdrew his hand from Marcus's shoulder and moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. One more thing. The combat boots on the windowsill. Patient safety protocol requires we remove personal items that might create a tripping hazard. Remove them, or I'll have maintenance do it. He left before she could respond. The door swung shut behind him with a whisper, and the room seemed to exhale. Natalie stood motionless for 12 seconds, her hands resting on the bed rail, her eyes on the boots that no longer belonged in this room. The dust of Marjah was going to be swept away. The last physical connection between her and the man sleeping in this bed was about to be erased. She reached out and adjusted the ventilator tubing, a small gesture of care that was technically unnecessary but gave her hand something to do besides shake. The machine wheezed on, indifferent. Marcus remained unconscious. The fluorescent lights continued their electric prayer above them, and somewhere down the corridor, a heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Everything in this hospital hummed along exactly as it was supposed to, following rules and protocols and procedures, all of them designed to protect the people who made the rules. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling had meant every word. He had meant the threat, the dismissal, the casual assertion of power. He had meant to establish dominance and confirm that he was in control of this unit, this patient, this space. And what he didn't know was that the woman standing in room 312 had once controlled the lives of 200 Marines across 3 provinces in Afghanistan. She had made medical decisions that saved lives under fire. She had carried men through terrain that wanted to kill them. She had been called Senior Chief Petty Officer by soldiers who would follow her into any darkness. He thought she was just a nurse. Natalie turned to face Marcus one more time. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the same way Sterling had, but this time the gesture was different. This time it was a promise. "I'm still here," she whispered, and the only other witness was the pair of combat boots sitting on the windowsill, gathering dust, waiting to be removed. She left room 312 and moved back into the corridor. The unit thrummed around her, the beep of monitors, the murmur of doctors' rounds, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. She had a 6:27 p.m. medication pass to complete. She had charts to review. She had a son waiting at home who still believed his mother was just what she appeared to be. But somewhere in the walls of Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Sterling was making phone calls. Somewhere, machinery that had been dormant was beginning to turn. Dr. Sterling entered room 347 like a man who owned the building. The Patterson family, daughter, son-in-law, elderly wife, sat clustered around the hospital bed where their father lay post-operative, still groggy from anesthesia. Natalie was adjusting his fur line when she felt Sterling's presence before she heard him speak, the way you sense a storm moving in before the first drop of rain. "Nurse Hayes." His voice carried the precision of a scalpel. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to the Patterson family why you countermanded my morphine order yesterday." The room went still. The beeping monitor seemed to grow louder, the four-pump ticking its mechanical rhythm, the blood pressure cuff hissing as it released. Natalie didn't turn around immediately. She completed the forecheck with the same steady hands that had once threaded tourniquets under fire in Marjah, that had held pressure on wounds while helicopters thundered overhead. Then she straightened and faced him, her face level, her eyes meeting his across the 3 feet of linoleum between them. "Your order was 15 milligrams, she said quietly. His renal function shows a creatinine of 2.4. The protocol." "I'm aware of the protocol, Nurse Nobody." Sterling's smile was a wolf smile, all teeth and no warmth. "What I'm asking is whether you understand your job description. Because my understanding is that nurses follow physician orders. They don't rewrite them." The Patterson daughter's face flushed a deep crimson. Her mother looked away, embarrassed by proxy. Sterling had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision, maximum humiliation, witnesses locked in place, no room for Natalie to respond without appearing insubordinate in front of people who would remember this conversation. It was a calculated public execution dressed up as a clinical discussion. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take 17 years ago when a convoy was rolling toward an IED and panic was a luxury no one could afford. A single tear escaped, not from distress, but from the sheer weight of restraint, the effort of holding 18 years of secrets behind the mask of a hospital nurse. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her voice emerging steady as water held perfectly still. "I understand you need this to be true." Sterling's jaw tightened. His smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes, a flash of frustration that she hadn't trembled, hadn't apologized, hadn't given him the satisfaction of her breaking. He turned and left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the sound of boots on tile. 2 days passed. The break room had become enemy territory. On Wednesday afternoon, Natalie pushed open the heavy door with her shoulder, exhausted from a 12-hour shift, needing coffee and 5 minutes of silence. 6 nurses occupied various corners of the room, at the small table, by the refrigerator, leaning against the counter. The moment she entered, a synchronization occurred so complete it could have been choreographed. The nurse at the table stood abruptly. The one by the fridge straightened up, suddenly urgent. Within 10 seconds, the room had emptied except for Natalie and the smell of burnt coffee in the pot. She sat alone. Wrapped both hands around her mug like it was the last warm thing in the world. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their endless mechanical song. Through the break room window, she could hear whispered conversations in the hallway just beyond the door, not loud enough to catch specific words, but loud enough to know they were about her. She caught fragments: disciplinary review, patient complaints, Sterling's already documented 3 incidents. She took one measured breath and held it. This was psychological warfare dressed up in hospital protocol. Sterling was isolating her, using the staff as proxy weapons because they were terrified of him, terrified of his phone calls to board members, his ability to determine shift assignments, his power to write up any nurse for any minor infraction and make it stick. He had transformed the break room into a zone of exile. The message was clear: you are untouchable. Even your colleagues are abandoning you. Natalie finished her coffee in silence and returned to work. On Thursday morning, a printout appeared on the unit board where every staff member had to pass during shift change. The letters were stark and official, printed on hospital letterhead with today's date and a case number. Written warning: formal disciplinary record. Employee, Hayes, N. Violation, insubordination and failure to follow established protocols. Details: willful deviation from physician orders, questioning clinical judgment of supervising physician, conduct unbecoming of professional standard. Action: written warning. Further violations will result in immediate termination. Supervisor: Dr. M. Sterling, MD. 3 nurses read it while pretending to check the assignment board. One looked at Natalie with something like pity. Another looked away entirely. Sterling had made sure the warning was public, permanent, impossible to ignore. He was building a paper trail, documentation of her insubordination that would make her firing, when it came, appear justified rather than retaliatory. Natalie stood before that board for 10 seconds. Took one measured breath. Then she pulled the printout down and walked directly to Sterling's office on the 3rd floor, her pace steady, her hands not shaking. She placed the warning on his desk and stepped back, meeting his gaze. Sterling was reviewing patient charts, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up slowly, deliberately, as if she'd interrupted him mid-thought. As if her presence was an inconvenience in his carefully ordered world. "I understand you need this to be true," she said. Sterling removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair, his expression settling into something that resembled a smile. "What I need, Nurse Nobody, is for you to understand your place." He gestured at the warning now lying on his desk. "That's 3 documented violations in 5 days. One more, and I have grounds for termination. So I suggest you start acting like a nurse instead of a—" He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, "whatever you think you are." Natalie didn't respond. She was already looking at the folder on his desk, the one partially obscured by his tablet. The tab read VHA Reimbursement, Experimental Protocols, Authorization 847X. Through the gap between the folder and his calendar, she could see payment figures. Column headers showed dates spanning 18 months. One figure caught her attention, $4,847,000 in reimbursement requests for experimental treatment interventions on the veteran patient wing. Sterling noticed her gaze and closed the folder with deliberate slowness. "Is there anything else, Nurse Nobody?" "No, sir," she said. Her voice like still water. She left his office and returned to the unit, her mind cataloging what she'd seen. The numbers didn't match what those patients had actually received. Sterling wasn't just providing unnecessary treatments, he was billing for treatments that never happened, using the comatose veterans as billing codes, processing federal reimbursements that would never result in actual care. The room went quiet as she passed the nursing station. Her phone sat in her scrub pocket, and her hands that had held sutures steady under IED explosions, hands that had carved tourniquets from paracord when medical supplies ran out, suddenly felt very still. That afternoon, Sterling made 4 phone calls from his office. The door was intentionally half open, allowing voices to carry into the hallway. "Board Member Richardson?" "Yes, I wanted to follow up on your concerns about liability." His voice carried the rehearsed tone of someone performing for an audience. A nurse operating outside her scope, making unilateral clinical decisions. "It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. I'm documenting everything." The next call, "Janet, it's Michael Sterling. I need to escalate a personnel matter. Can you have HR initiate a credential verification on one of my nurses?" "Yes, formal investigation. I'm concerned about her background." By Friday morning, 2 hospital investigators in dark blazers appeared at the nursing station asking for the unit manager. They had credentials that identified them as part of the hospital's internal compliance division, though their demeanor suggested something more official than standard human resources procedure. "We need to verify employment credentials on Natalie Hayes," one said, clipboard in hand. "Background check is showing some inconsistencies. Previous employer references aren't checking out." The unit manager, pale and apologetic, pulled Natalie's file. It was thin, only 5 years of employment history, starting at Oak Creek Memorial. Everything before that was a blank space. The investigators made calls to the numbers listed as references from her prior position. One number connected to a disconnected line message. The second number, listed as a Department of Defense contact, rang to a recording. "This number is no longer in service." The third number, supposedly from a medical facility in San Diego, reached a confused receptionist who had no record of anyone by that name ever being employed there. The investigators exchanged a glance. One made a note on his clipboard, "No verifiable employment history prior to current position. All prior references non-responsive or invalid." That same afternoon, during her break, Natalie returned to room 312. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb remained exactly as he had been for 3 years, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, the landscape of a man suspended between consciousness and nothing. But something had changed in his chart. New orders. New handwriting. All from Sterling. Reduce respiratory support by 10%. Discontinue experimental treatment protocol. Begin comfort care measures. The experimental treatment that had shown actual improvement in Webb's motor response over the past 6 months, the treatment that required justification and documentation and careful monitoring, was being systematically dismantled. Natalie understood immediately. Sterling was managing Webb toward a natural decline. If the patient's condition deteriorated, if the experimental protocol failed to produce results, there would be no justification for continued billing. But the billing had already been submitted. The reimbursement had already been approved. All Sterling needed was for the patient to decline just enough that continued treatment appeared futile, and the fraud would become invisible. She photographed the new orders with her phone, hand steady, jaw tight. 7 years ago, she'd photographed classified documents in a safe house in Marjah for the exact same reason: evidence. Documentation. Proof. Step away from that patient. Sterling's voice came from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him enter the room, which meant he'd been watching from the doorway long enough to know she was reviewing the chart with unusual attention. Natalie turned slowly. Sterling stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his expression neutral but his eyes bright with something that looked like satisfaction. Effective immediately, he continued, "You're removed from all veteran patient assignments. Patient safety concern. Security concern. Your access to this wing is revoked." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling security to escort you out." Natalie took one measured breath. Around her, the room held its breath too. The ventilator wheezed, the monitors beeped, the 4 pumps ticked their mechanical rhythm. "I understand you need this to be true," she said. But she didn't move from Marcus's bedside. Not yet. She looked down at the man in the hospital bed, at the staff sergeant who carried her name tattooed on his forearm, the man she'd saved 18 years ago and then been forced to forget existed. His chest rose and fell. His eyes remained closed. Somewhere in the wreckage of his nervous system, neurons still fired. Somewhere, at the deepest level, he was still fighting. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Security was coming. The monitor alarm cut through the quiet like a chainsaw through silk. Room 312. 2:47 in the morning. Tuesday. The cardiac wing was supposed to be Natalie's domain now. Sterling had made that abundantly clear during yesterday's public crucifixion. Veteran patients were off limits. Critical care rotation was suspended. She was confined to post-op recovery, where the only thing she could damage was someone's comfort level. But the charge nurse, Rebecca, had caught her in the hallway at 2:30 with desperation written across her face. "I need someone for monitor watch. Jenny's covering 3 rooms alone. ICU is understaffed." The shift supervisor had approved it quietly, a small mercy offered by someone who'd seen Natalie's face after Sterling's warning. "Just the cardiac patients," Rebecca had said. "Nothing else?" Natalie had nodded. "Just the cardiac patients." But the alarm was coming from room 312. Marcus Webb's room. She was already moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory from Marjah, from Sanjan Valley, from FOB Shank, where you didn't wait for permission to save a life. You moved. You saved. You asked for forgiveness later, if you survived long enough to apologize. The hallway lights blurred past. Her shoes made no sound on the polished floor. By the time she reached his door, she could hear the other alarm, the one inside the room that meant something had shifted. The ventilator still cycled steadily, but the numbers were wrong. O2 sat dropping fast. Heart rate climbing. BP rising. The physiological signature of pressure building inside the chest cavity where no pressure should be. Marcus lay motionless in the darkness, his face illuminated only by the glow of monitors that were now screaming at her in color. His chest wasn't moving. The ventilator was pushing air into his lungs, but his lungs weren't expanding. That meant the air had nowhere to go. Pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. But his vitals said something worse, something that made her hands move before she finished the diagnosis. His lips were turning blue. The color wasn't spreading slowly. It was creeping across his mouth like a shadow at dusk, and his neck veins were distended like he was being strangled from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. Not a slow bleed. A mechanical trap. His collapsed lung was pushing his heart aside, kinking his superior vena cava, stopping blood from returning to his chambers. He had minutes. Maybe less. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered, and she meant it for everything, for the name on his arm, for the 3 kilometers through enemy fire, for the fact that she couldn't tell him who she was before saving his life again. The assigned nurse was on break. The code team was for minutes away. She could hear their footsteps already, distant, unhurried. They didn't know yet. The monitors didn't show tachycardia to them, they showed the routine vital sign escalation of a ventilated patient. They'd get there in time for the professional approach. For the chest tube kit and the X-ray confirmation and the protocol that kept everyone comfortable and safe and followed. Marcus would code before they arrived. His heart would stop before they even reached the 2nd floor. Natalie moved to the crash cart. The drawers slid open without resistance. She didn't search. She knew exactly where the 14-gauge angiocath lived. She'd known for 18 years, since a field medic in the mountains had shown her the difference between knowing where something was and knowing how to use it when everything was on fire. Her fingers found the needle. The world compressed into the space between her hands and his chest. Everything else, Sterling's threats, the formal write-up, the investigation into her background, the phone calls being made to places that didn't exist anymore, everything compressed into nothing. There was only this, a man whose name she carried and whose hand she'd never stopped seeing in her dreams. She tore his gown open. The monitor's glow showed her the landscape of his chest, the familiar geography of ribs and intercostal spaces she'd navigated countless times before, though never in a hospital, never under fluorescent lights that would burn away her anonymity. 2 fingers found his ribs. Counted them. 1. 2. The space between them was where pressure and air met. Where death became a choice. She felt for the exact location, the midclavicular line, 2nd intercostal space, the landmark she'd memorized while living under a different name in a different life. The needle was steady in her hand. Not trembling. Not hesitating. Steady like a surgical laser. She drove it in. Between the ribs. Through the muscle. Into the cavity where atmosphere had no business being. The resistance gave way, and then came the sound that meant everything, the hiss of trapped air escaping like a held breath finally released. Compressed air that had been squeezing his heart rushed past the needle with the force of months of suffocation. The catheter stayed in place while the pressure bled away, and his chest, his actual chest, not the ventilator's mechanical expansion, expanded. His ribs rose. His lungs filled with actual oxygen again. His lips went from blue toward something closer to human color. The monitor showed it happening in real time, oxygen saturation climbing. 88, 91. 94, sinus rhythm returned like a punch from a man waking up. His heart had been seconds away from stopping. Now it remembered how to beat. 12 seconds. That was the entire medical intervention. 12 seconds between a man dead and a man alive. 12 seconds before the code team arrived, and in that moment, that single fragment of time, everything broke. The door to room 312 swung open and Dr. Sterling stopped in the threshold. He was still in his coat from the emergency department, called for what he thought was a standard code blue, and he was seeing something that turned the blood in his face to stone. A nurse. Not a physician. Not a paramedic. A nurse in scrubs holding a 14-gauge catheter between a patient's ribs while the monitor screen showed the patient stabilizing instead of spiraling. Sterling's eyes went to the needle. To her face. To Marcus's expanding chest. Back to her face. The progression of understanding moved across his expression like weather systems, confusion first, then clarity, then something colder. His jaw locked. His hands clenched. The code team burst through moments later, 5 people moving with practiced urgency who suddenly found themselves facing a room where the emergency had already been managed. Their eyes went to the catheter. To the vital signs. To the patient who should have been in arrest and wasn't. To Natalie, whose hands were still positioned exactly where they'd been when she saved his life. "What the hell did you just do?" Sterling's voice was quiet. That was the worst part, not shouting, not anger that crackled and burned. Just ice water spoken in a tone that made the entire room freeze solid. "Needle decompression," Natalie said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, or from very deep underground. "Tension pneumothorax." He had maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. "I'm aware of the condition," Sterling said. His eyes moved to the rest of the code team, then back to her. "Everyone out. Except Nurse Hayes." His voice wasn't a request. It was a command, and nurses knew the difference between those things better than anyone else in medicine. They knew which orders could be questioned and which ones belonged to the gravity of institutions that didn't break for compassion. The team filed out, taking their equipment, their surprise, their silence with them. The door closed. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Marcus Webb breathed through his ventilator, alive in ways that Sterling's medical negligence hadn't intended, and Dr. Sterling stood inches from Natalie's face in the darkness of a hospital room that had just become a courtroom. "You just ended your career," he said. "Needle decompression is a procedure reserved for physicians and paramedics with advanced certification. It sits so far outside your scope of practice that you've given me everything I need. Criminal negligence. Practicing medicine without a license. Endangering a patient." His voice was still calm, which made it worse than any rage could have been. Rage was emotion. This was institutional power speaking to itself, confirming its own validity. "I'm calling security. You're done here. Today. This shift ends now." Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came after firefights, after IEDs, after standing over bodies and having to choose between grief and function. She let a single tear escape, just one, the way she'd learned to do years ago when crying was a luxury and composure was survival. She didn't wipe it away. She let it run, and she held Sterling's gaze without flinching. "I understand you need this to be true," she said. The words landed somewhere in the space between them, heavy as a body bag. Sterling's face flushed red. Finally, the anger that had been calcifying into ice decided to burn. "I don't care what you understand. I care about protocol. I care about the fact that you just performed a procedure you're not qualified to perform, and somehow managed to save this patient anyway, which makes you both a liability and a threat." Natalie looked at Marcus. His chest was expanding steadily now. Color had returned to his face in ways that wouldn't have happened if she'd waited for protocol, for procedure, for Sterling's carefully constructed system of fraud and negligence. His heart was beating. His lungs were filling. Everything about him screamed alive. "His breathing," she said quietly. "That's what matters." "What matters," Sterling said, moving toward the door, "is that security will be here in 3 minutes, and you'll be escorted from this hospital. By end of shift, I'll have filed reports that will ensure no facility in this state ever hires you again. You chose to throw away your career for one patient. I hope it was worth it." He left. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Natalie stood alone in the darkness of room 312, her heart still racing at a speed that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with understanding exactly what she'd just lost. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it had taken her 18 years of invisibility, 18 years of staying quiet and keeping her head down and accepting humiliation like a penance, to protect her son. To protect the family she'd promised herself she'd have after the military erased her. and she'd just blown all of that apart for a man whose face she couldn't remember saving, for a veteran whose only connection to her was a tattoo he'd gotten in a place that didn't officially exist, for a moment of medical necessity that had felt less like a choice and more like muscle memory waking up to remind her of who she actually was. She reached down and checked Marcus's lines. Confirmed the catheter placement. Made sure everything was secure in the way that came from training so deep it had become bone knowledge. Then she stepped back, pulled his gown closed, and walked toward the door to meet security. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of pale green. Her reflection moved past her in the window, a nurse in scrubs, hair coming loose from its regulation bun, eyes that looked like they belonged to someone who'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She barely recognized herself. Which meant Sterling wouldn't either. Which meant he had absolutely no idea who he'd just fired. By 7 in the morning, Dr. Sterling had made 4 phone calls. The first was to hospital legal at 6:15, his voice precise, measured, controlled. Reckless endangerment, he said. A nurse performing a procedure far beyond her scope. We need documentation, we need protection, we need this file before she lawyered up. The second call went to the State Nursing Board at 6:32. The third to board member Harrison at 6:47. The fourth to board member Reeves at 6:59. Each conversation followed the same script: liability concerns, unauthorized medical intervention, a patient's life placed at risk by someone operating outside her credentials. Each call ended the same way. I'm protecting Oak Creek Memorial, Sterling said. From her. By 9 o'clock, 2 investigators from the State Medical Board sat in Sterling's office with clipboards and questions. They wanted to know about Natalie Hayes's training. Her certifications. Her previous employment. Sterling provided a personnel file that was, technically, accurate: current job, current credentials, nothing that would raise flags if you didn't know what you were looking for. But the investigators were thorough. They called the number listed for her previous employer in San Diego. The phone rang to a disconnect. They called a reference in Virginia. The voicemail said the number was no longer in service. They called 3 more numbers from her original application. All disconnected. All gone. It was as if Natalie Hayes had materialized in Houston 5 years ago with no past before that moment, no trail, no verifiable history, no digital footprint that extended back further than her hire date at Oak Creek Memorial. One investigator looked at her supervisor. That's unusual, he said quietly. Very unusual. By noon, Natalie was still working. She moved through the critical care unit with the same precision as always, checking monitors, adjusting flow rates, charting vitals on patients who would never know her name. She'd heard the whispers in the break room, the phone calls about investigation and credentials review. She'd heard Sterling's voice on the unit phone, clipped and professional, speaking to someone about immediate personnel action. She did not flinch. She did not call anyone. She simply worked, and when noon came and went, she continued working, because stopping would mean acknowledging that something had changed, and Natalie Hayes did not acknowledge things that hadn't been said to her face yet. At 3 o'clock, Morrison arrived at the nurse's station. He was the security chief, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a uniform that never quite fit right. Natalie saw him coming and her hands paused above the medication cart. He carried a cardboard box under one arm. Inside that box would be her personal belongings, the family photo of David and Jake, the coffee mug that said RN and tired, the combat boots she'd placed on Marcus Webb's windowsill. Nurse Hayes, Morrison said, and his voice carried the weight of someone delivering bad news. I need you to collect your personal belongings. She did not ask questions. She did not speak. She simply closed the medication cart, walked to her locker, and began removing things. The photo came first. Then the mug. Then she reached for the shelf where the boots had been and found them gone. Someone had already taken them from Marcus's room, already understood that they mattered. 20 staff members watched as she placed each item in the cardboard box. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a pale, clinical glow, the kind of light that makes people look almost translucent, almost invisible. Morrison walked her to the exit in silence. His face was apologetic, jaw tight, as though he was following orders he didn't believe in. The rain started as they reached the parking lot, not a gentle rain but a cold Houston downpour that came without warning, the kind of weather that made the sky feel low enough to touch. Natalie walked to her car with the cardboard box in her arms, and she did not look back at the hospital that had been her refuge for 5 years. She drove home in a daze, the rain hammering against the windshield like something trying to break through. By evening, she had changed into black clothes and driven to Pinewood Cemetery. The rain continued, relentless, cold. She found David's grave the way she always did, even though she hadn't been there in months. The headstone read David Hayes, loving husband and father, Navy SEAL. The dates were carved in stone. Everything else was memory. She stood there with her forehead pressed against the cold granite, and her voice when it came was barely a whisper. I promised you I'd keep my head down. I promised you I'd stay invisible for Jake, that I'd never surface again, that we could just live and nobody would ever know. The words broke apart like shrapnel. And I couldn't even do that. I saved a life. I did exactly what we trained for, what we bled for, and they fired me for it. Rain mixed with tears on her face. Sterling wanted me to break, wanted me to crack under pressure. But I didn't. So he broke me anyway, just through different methods. He was more patient. More strategic. More like him than like us. She pressed her palm flat against the headstone. I failed you. I failed our son. I promised you we'd disappear and I didn't. The cemetery was empty except for the sound of rain. She stood there for an hour, maybe longer. Time felt different now, marked by a before and after that had happened at exactly 3 o'clock. At home, Jake found her at the kitchen table soaked and hollow, staring at nothing like the table might contain answers if she looked long enough. He was 17, old enough to recognize the shape of disaster. Mom, what happened? She couldn't meet his eyes. I lost my job. We'll figure it out. He didn't push. He went to his room, and she heard him moving things, shifting boxes, searching for something in the quiet way young men do when they've decided something without saying it out loud. By morning, everything had changed again. The hospital board convened at 9 o'clock sharp in the conference room, 8 board members, Sterling standing at the head of the table, hospital legal counsel taking notes, the investigators with their files. Sterling presented his case with the smooth confidence of a man who'd already won. Unauthorized procedure. Violation of protocols. Suspicious employment history. No verifiable references. A patient's life placed at risk. A liability that Oak Creek Memorial could not afford. She's dangerous, Sterling concluded. And we need to protect ourselves accordingly. The board chair nodded. One member was already reaching for her pen to sign the termination order when the conference room door opened. Nobody had knocked. The door simply opened, and Jake walked in carrying something wrapped in black cloth, a shadow box, the kind museums used to display things that matter. Sterling stood. This is a closed meeting. Young man, you need to. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Jake said, and he said the words his mother had forbidden him to ever speak. The room went silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that pushes down on your chest. Jake set the shadow box on the conference table. His hands were steady but his voice was trembling, not from fear but from something larger, something that lived in the space between rage and pride. He opened the box. Inside were medals. Ribbons. Photographs. Documents stamped with symbols that didn't belong in a hospital board room. Margaret Chen, the head nurse, reached for the file with shaking hands and began to read. Her voice cracked on the first line, Navy Cross for actions in Marjah, Afghanistan. An FBI agent stepped forward from the back of the conference room, his credentials catching the fluorescent light. His name was Torres. His voice was the kind that had delivered death notifications to families and interrogations to suspects, measured, official, without apology. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, he said, reading from a classified file that shouldn't have existed in a hospital boardroom, was the primary operative who extracted intelligence from Marjah that prevented a coordinated attack on 4 American cities. The room didn't move. Board members exchanged glances like they were watching a magic trick they didn't understand. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. Torres continued, his words falling like concrete blocks. Her disappearance from all federal records was mandated by national security protocols following Operation Blind Summit. Her cover was just violated, deliberately, to prevent this hospital from being destroyed by a federal fraud investigation we've been building for 14 months. He turned directly to Sterling. 63 veteran patients. 400,000 in fraudulent Medicare billing. You billed for experimental treatments that were never administered while systematically removing the one nurse who could expose you. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of ruined things. Sterling's hand shook as he reached for the water glass in front of him. His fingers didn't steady it. Water sloshed across the mahogany table. "This is absurd," he whispered. "You can't possibly." His voice cracked like ice. Agent Torres nodded to the security guard who'd escorted Natalie out the previous afternoon. The man, Morrison, his name tag read, carried a cardboard box identical to the one Natalie had held. He set it down in front of Sterling with the gentleness of someone placing a bomb. Sterling's box. His belongings. Morrison's voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man who'd been part of something he now understood. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling stood. His chair scraped backward, the sound sharp as breaking bone. Board members watched him move toward the door like watching a man walk into the ocean. No one stood. No one spoke. He was already gone before the gravity of what had happened fully settled into the room. Margaret Chen, the head nurse who'd once stood silent while Sterling dressed down Natalie in front of a patient's family, spoke first. Her voice trembled. "She tried to tell us the billing code questions, the discrepancies in Marcus Webb's treatment plan. She was trying to protect those patients." She looked toward the empty chair where Natalie had sat yesterday, carrying her life in a cardboard box. "We didn't listen." Commander Price, still wearing dress blues, still carrying the weight of command like a weapon, stepped closer to the board table. "You removed a Navy Cross recipient from patient care because she threatened your criminal operation. You endangered a disabled Marine to cover it." His voice was quiet, which made it worse. Quiet voices from men like Price contained entire wars. That won't happen again. The press conference came 3 weeks later. Board Chair Richardson announced a new position, funded by the recovered fraud money seized from Sterling's personal accounts and the hospital's fraudulent billing accounts. Patient Advocacy Director. The role existed to ensure what happened to Natalie Hayes never happened again. They announced that Natalie Hayes had accepted the position. Margaret Chen read the formal apology without looking up from the podium. "We failed one of America's heroes. We allowed her to be humiliated and dismissed when she was protecting our patients. We failed to listen. We will do better." Natalie stood to the side of the podium, not at it. She didn't need a microphone. The room already belonged to her, had always belonged to her, but now everyone finally understood it. Her son Jake sat in the front row, wearing his father's Navy SEAL trident pin beneath his collar. Commander Price stood in the back. Neither of them clapped. They just nodded, the way warriors acknowledge other warriors. Highway 6, 3 weeks into Sterling's new career. A folding table with a banner reading "Supplemental Health Insurance, ask about our rates." Sterling sat behind it wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo, the kind of shirt that came from a bulk order bin. His phone showed 17 missed calls from attorneys. His billing was gone. His medical license was under investigation. His retirement accounts had been seized. An elderly couple approached the table. Sterling's face lifted, hungry, desperate. He gave his pitch about coverage tiers and deductible caps. They shook their heads and kept walking. For hours. 0 sales. The sun moved across the sky like a judgment. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Natalie moved through the corridors like she owned them now, because she did. Patient Advocacy Director. Badge on her scrubs. She conducted morning rounds in the critical care unit, checking on patients, documenting concerns, ensuring that every voice got heard. Her presence made the air pressure change in a way that made junior nurses straighten their posture and attending physicians think twice before dismissing a concern. Room 312 was the last stop on her advocacy rounds. She'd placed fresh flowers on the windowsill yesterday, sunflowers, Marcus's favorites, according to the intake form his mother had filled out 3 years ago. The worn combat boots sat beside them, caked with the dust of Marjah, the dust of extraction, the dust of a 3-kilometer extraction through enemy fire that Marcus had survived because Natalie Hayes had refused to leave him behind. She touched one boot as she entered, a habit now, a ritual. His vitals had been improving steadily over the past 6 months. Real treatment. Proper respiratory support. The experimental therapy actually administered, not just billed. Recovery was possible now. The medical team said there was a chance, not a guarantee, never that, but a genuine chance that a disabled Marine could wake up. Marcus Webb's fingers twitched. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, rapid eye movement, the kind that happens when the brain is trying to remember something vast. Natalie stood at his bedside, watching, waiting. His eyelids flickered. Opened. Closed. Opened again. He was looking at the ceiling first, confused, the way patients wake, disoriented, searching for context. His eyes tracked right, toward the window, toward the boots, toward something his body remembered even if his mind hadn't caught up yet. Recognition flickered across his face like a match striking. Not where am I recognition. Not what happened recognition. More basic recognition. Survival recognition. Those boots meant something. Those boots meant home. His eyes found her. His mouth worked, trying to form words after 3 years of silence. A sound emerged, rough as gravel, barely human. Natalie leaned closer. Her voice was steady, the voice of a senior chief. It's okay, Marcus. You're safe. You're home. His right hand lifted, trembling, fighting gravity and neural pathways that had forgotten how to fire. He looked at her face with the desperate concentration of someone solving an equation that meant his life. Then his eyes moved to his own left forearm. The tattoo. The ink he'd gotten in Marjah during a 72-hour liberty, the letters dark and permanent, Natalie Hayes. His eyes snapped back to her face. Memory hit him like a breach charge. Not all of it, the brain doesn't return from 3 years of silence complete and whole, but enough. The extraction. Her face above his. Her hand steady despite incoming fire. Her voice telling him to breathe, to stay alive, to hold on. A single word escaped his lips, hoarse as wind through a canyon, you. Natalie's eyes filled. She smiled, and the smile was older than grief. Welcome back, Marine. She took his hand. His grip was weak, the grip of a body rebuilding itself, but present. Alive. Real. Jake appeared in the doorway with Commander Price. Both of them had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it, believing in it in the way warriors believe in things. Jake's grin was pure light, Mom, his awake. Marcus's eyes moved to Price, and recognition flickered there too, different recognition, older memory, the kind carved into bone. Price stepped forward, and his voice carried the weight of command, of brotherhood, of understanding. Good to see you, Sergeant Webb. You've got one hell of a guardian angel. Marcus's grip tightened on Natalie's hand, his eyes never leaving her face. Outside the window, Houston traffic flowed like blood through veins. The city didn't know what was happening in this room. The world didn't know. But in room 312, a disabled war hero remembered the operator who'd carried him 3 kilometers through enemy fire, remembered the face above his, remembered why he was alive. That same afternoon, Margaret Chen conducted a training session for hospital staff. The final slide of her presentation read, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." Natalie stood in the back of the room, wearing scrubs by choice, ready for her afternoon advocacy rounds. She touched the navy crosspin hidden beneath her collar, a small weight against her chest, a reminder that some honors aren't meant to be visible. In the parking lot across town, Sterling packed up his folding table as the strip mall closed for the day. 0 sales. Tomorrow he'd be back at the same table, at the same strip mall, pushing the same insurance policies to people who didn't want them, living in the new normal he'd created for himself, invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. The punishment wasn't prison. The punishment was invisibility. The punishment was irrelevance. The punishment was becoming what he'd tried to make Natalie Hayes become. The quiet ones. The overlooked ones. They're the ones who hold everything together. They're the ones who save lives in the dark. They're the ones who carry secrets, carry honor, carry wounds that never fully heal. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you meet one. If you're very lucky, you recognize them before it's too late. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever seen someone's hidden strength revealed, share your story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of unrecognized heroes among us. Like this video if you believe that the quietest people in the room might just be the ones holding it all together. Because sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.